Blumenthal, and this is the 35th episode, remarkably, of Reinventing School. We have covered lots and lots of territory with lots of wonderful guests, and today we begin sort of a new arc, a new cycle about what is being taught in school. We really haven't hit that the way I think it deserves, because that's actually what kids do in school is they learn stuff in specific subjects. And we're going to begin with mathematics, but over the next month, 2 months, we'll probably do social studies and science and probably physical education and health and a bunch of different subjects. But we begin, and I'm grateful to John Ewing and also to Megan Burton, who you'll meet in a second, for helping me figure out exactly what it is that I mean to be asking here and how we begin to construct something. So you just do some quick hellos, and you guys are always better at introducing yourselves than I am introducing. So Megan, tell us where you are and what you do and how you ended up doing it.
Yes, well, I'm Megan Burton, and I'm excited to be here. I'm at Auburn University in Alabama, and I teach future elementary school teachers. And those that are currently teaching, I provide support and teach graduate courses and things such as that. I was an elementary teacher, first through fourth grade, for 10 years, and that led me to want to help support teachers in what they're doing and elevate their voice and elevate the voice of students that are brilliant. And so that's what led me into teacher education. And I'm now the president-elect of the Association of Math Teacher Educators, which represent membership that support teachers, whether they're teacher candidates or whether they're currently teaching in their work.
Cool. Thank you. John, I'm guessing you're not in Alabama. I think you're in New York, if I remember.
I am. That's not so far from Alabama, though. So, I'm John Ewing. I'm a mathematician. I've come to education later in life. I was actually just an ordinary mathematician at Indiana University for 25 years. And
what does a mathematician do?
That's the question everybody who sits next to you on an airplane asks. Mm-hmm. And it's a very hard question. It's not that we sit around inventing numbers, but mathematics is like science. I mean, it's incomplete, right? People are still discovering new mathematics every single day. And in fact, we're living in a pandemic where mathematics plays a crucial role in trying to model what's going on and trying to predict what's going to happen with vaccines. And so mathematics is a live subject that's going on all the time. And when you're a research mathematician, that's what you do. But of course, almost all mathematicians also educate.
Okay. So behind you is a logo. Mm-hmm. And I know you're with an organization. So can you explain a bit about your background and also your what it is that's behind you?
Yeah.
And solve the problem and solve the equation behind your head too.
What's behind is pi over 4 is the answer to that equation.
Thank you.
So
I knew that.
That's now you'll know that. Yeah. So well, anyway, I was a mathematician for 25 years. I actually then went to the American Mathematical Society, where that's a society for research mathematicians, about 30,000 mathematicians. It's a big organization, over 200 employees. They publish things and they support research mathematics. So I was there for 15 years, and now I've come to Math for America, and I've been here for the last 12. Math for America is a program for K-12 math and science teachers. We do both math and science. We're about half and half. We have 1,000 teachers here in New York City, which is, by the way, about 10% of the math and science teachers in New York City. And it's a fellowship program. They come together in a community. They take workshops. They give workshops. We give almost 900 two-hour workshops every single year. About 2/3 of those are taught by the teachers themselves. They are incredibly talented math and science teachers, really the most talented. And they learn from one another, math or science, pedagogy or policy, or anything that teachers are interested in.
All right. So I'm going to ask some maybe fairly obvious questions, and where I'm leading to, which we three have spoken about before, are we teaching, given the number of hours that we have, and John is going to figure that out in a second, but given the number of instructional hours that we have in a lifetime of K through 12 life as a student, how much of that are we devoting to math? What are we doing with that time, which we'll all talk about? And is it enough? Is it too much? Does it need to be reinvented in some way? Is it absolutely perfect? And these questions will also come up as we explore science and social studies and other areas. Um, so John, kick us off briefly and do the basic equation for us. How much time? I'm starting kindergarten now. How many hours in classroom, I guess, am I going to be spending on mathematics? And how much homework am I doing, right? Because that's part of the formula too.
Of course, it varies, right? Math. First of all, math is a subject that's vertically organized. So you have to learn and master certain things at the bottom, and then you have to build on that and get to the middle and then keep going on up.
Isn't that like every other subject or not?
That's not so true. So science, for example, you can start in the middle. You can start in lots of different places. Actually, the same thing is true in almost every subject. Reading requires some building up in the beginning, but then after that, you can go off and learn different kinds of skills in reading. But math is really vertical. And that's
before we do the math, before we do the arithmetic, Megan, you spent a lot of time in classroom, right? So give us a sense of that vertical question. Do you find that most do subjects stack up vertically and horizontally or diagonally? Like how do you think about this?
I personally would agree with John on that. First of all, it's interesting at universities that math is one of the few that has their, department rather than multiple colleges. And part of that is because in so many other areas you can go across, when we talk about social studies, that involves history, geography, all these different venues that don't necessarily build on each other. So I think that's definitely true. And one of the things that's important for teachers, parents, and children to all recognize is that children come to us knowing parts of math, and we build on that, and we have to keep building. And sometimes teachers come in and just say, you're in third grade, this is what you need to know, instead of looking at where the learner is and how
right. And we'll talk about how we advance through. So let me come back to the other question about how many. So how many hours what am I signing up for here? I'm a kindergartner signing a contract, right?
You're talking like a businessman.
Okay.
And education isn't business. And,
fair enough.
So it's the wrong question, how many hours? It's not that it's immaterial. Of course, you should decide how much you're going to spend on each area, but it's going to differ by year. It's going to differ by time of year.
Sure.
That's just the wrong question here.
I understand, but if we're dealing with a finite number of hours, 4, 5, maybe 6 hours of instruction per day, and they're doing that 5 days a week, and you multiply by 40 weeks a year, that's an amount of time that teachers are being paid to work, and school buildings are left open, and all that other stuff, right? And a portion of that seems to be about 10 or 15% according to the OECD, and that's not just US, seems to be across the board. So that's a substantial chunk by the way that I figure it. So we were talking before, it's 10 or maybe 12,000 hours of instruction, and maybe a little more than that. And if we're looking at 10% of that, that means that we're spending about 1,000 hours each as a, and maybe more plus homework, right? So another few hundred or more in that. So how does that ring for you? Acknowledging that it is a business way of looking at it, but in many ways, education is a business as well. And we're plowing lots and lots of kids through, and there's a standardization thing and all that. So am I close with my calculation?
Megan, I'll let you hit that first.
Well, I was going to say part of it, it's so difficult to quantify because, for instance,
wait, I just want to be clear here. I'm talking to two math dudes, and you're saying to me it's too difficult to quantify. All right, keep going.
Let me explain why. That's where I'm about to get. For example, when we talk about in mathematics, a huge part of mathematics is learning to think about math, how to persist, how to ask questions, how to critically analyze things. And that often interweaves with some of the science that you're learning. So, in social
Sure.
studies, when you're looking at graphs, I mean, just like in our world, we don't go and do math unless you're a mathematician, as John was. We're often
Sure.
doing math everywhere we are.
Right.
And so as an elementary teacher, whenever possible, I'm going to integrate it into the child's community as well as into what we're doing. And I think that's happening even at the high school level, just with what's happened this last year.
Sure.
There's been mathematics connected to the pandemic and what's going on. And so to isolate it and say, how much time do we spend on math becomes really challenging, because my hope is it's not just math.
Now, wouldn't we say the same thing about science or history or
Of course.
geography?
This is education. This is you'd say the same thing about education. I mean, you can't, if a teacher can actually answer your question, then they're not doing a good job teaching.
Really? Okay.
And so that's why I'm pushing back on this. Can I just sort of reframe things a little bit?
Please do.
Maybe this will get us going, and then we can come back to this thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's sort of, for me, there are always 5 principles that are big, broad things about math education in particular, although I think they apply to lots of education. One is, especially in math, you need to start early.
Is that pre-K or earlier?
Yeah, pre-K. There's lots of research out there that shows that kids that have been exposed to numbers and number sense and math kinds of things, and even algebraic thinking early, really
What's
young.
Number sense? It's not a term I know.
Number sense. Well, it's sort of a sense. So you were figuring out how many hours kids spend in school. So intuitively, you sort of saw that about 10,000 is about the right kind of number. What's 10,000 mean? What's it? Does that make sense? If you'd multiplied and gotten 100,000 hours, you probably would have known immediately that was way too big.
Okay.
So it's just a sense about what numbers are, how they're big and small. So, but kids starting early is really important. I think everybody today realizes that in math, you need to avoid what's called the mile wide and inch deep thing, where you spread every year, you sort of try to do lots and lots of things, but you just touch on them. Kids need to be exposed to focus on certain topics in math as they go through the curriculum. The third thing is you don't really teach math. Well, you teach math, but you're really teaching curiosity and wonder. You're not teaching drill. You're not, and you don't want to make math drudgery.
All right.
Math
Well, that's
is supposed to be curiosity.
So if those are 3, I'm going to come back to the other 2. Megan, do you find that the teachers you work with and the work you've done involves curiosity and what was the other term you used, John?
And wonder.
And wonder. Or if I were to ask your students or others, they would probably say memorization. Like, how would they characterize it? And would it be different from what John just said or similar?
Our goal, and what we know from research and from effective teachers, the teachers of the year that you interviewed, is that yes, that's where we hope they are. The challenge is that for so long, it wasn't taught with the wonder and curiosity and sense making. And I think, as John said, it needs to start at an early age. And remember, most of your elementary and early childhood teachers across the nation come in wanting to teach young learners, and they may or may not enjoy the actual content of mathematics. So our challenge is to help them not only understand math, but also realize it makes sense, and to recognize that seeing things in multiple ways and asking questions and seeing connections is what they need to focus on.
And there's one point that is probably very obvious to you, but may not be obvious to people outside the world of math or parents. We've bifurcated it, right? So you've got teachers who specialize in mathematics from grade 7 up or 6 up, or however things are organized. But a classroom teacher in primary school has to be a math specialist, a social studies teacher, right? All of that. So you have two very different ways of thinking about what children need to know.
And it depends on what state you're in and their certification differences for sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's that tension of young teachers of young children, that tension of knowing the child as a whole and integrating it in a meaningful way, but also making sure they understand math, and not only math content, but they understand the way children learn, what we call learning trajectories, the way they think about math, and think about that in all subjects if they are self-contained. There's advantages and weaknesses to both ways.
Wouldn't that be shaped to a great extent by that K-6 teacher? I mean, that's my introduction to, or pre-K-6, right? So by the time the 7th grade math specialty teacher gets, or probably a better term, but the 7th grade math professional gets them into the classroom, that teacher is highly dependent on what happened for the last 6 or 7 years. How good is elementary school? So we'll come back around to that, because John, I interrupted you. You have to give us 4 and 5, please.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not sure whether I want to follow up on what you just said first, but let me finish my 4 and 5.
Yeah.
And so the other thing, the fourth, is that you need to connect. When you're teaching math to kids, it needs to be connected. In particular, it needs to be connected to science. I'd say it has to be connected to everything, because it can be connected to social studies and history and other things too. But in particular, it can be connected to science. Math and science should have lots of overlap. And increasingly in schools today, you see that. That's great instruction. That's also why you can't just say, this minute I'm working on math and this minute I'm working on physics. That's not the way education works.
Is it the way school is organized?
Well, it is more. First of all, it is at K-6 already.
Sure.
And it's by the way, it's not always K-6. It could be K-5. In some cases, it's K-4. And but it's increasingly it's organized. It's the way schools should be organized, and increasingly it is organized that way. Frankly, that's one of the great things. I'm sorry, I'm going to put a tiny plug in for Math for America. We've got 1,000 math and science teachers, 1,000 teachers, the most accomplished. They are so hungry to talk to one another. That's one of the best things we can do when there isn't a pandemic, is to bring them into our space in the evening and have them sit around and talk math and science and biology. And they desperately want to talk to one another. And anyway, it should be that way. And the final thing that makes all of this work is you've got to have teachers that can do these things that we're talking about. And nothing works if you don't have teachers who know the subject they're teaching, who love the subject they're teaching, and who know the craft of teaching. If you don't have those people, none of this works.
So how are we doing?
And I would add into that, though, also knowing their learners and their community.
And their students. I actually left out the know their students. Know the subject, know the craft, know your students. And I have to say that know your students at first sounds like it's a kind of one of those squishy things, feel good things. But boy, is it important, especially in a place like New York City. You've got to know the people that you're teaching, and it makes a huge difference.
I would think especially in Alabama too. I think especially anywhere, right?
But in urban inner city environments, it's you've really got to know what's going on. Anyway, those are the things I think that frame great teaching, and they sort of show why it's not a matter of hours that you're standing in front. And by the way, almost no one stands in front of students in lectures anymore. That's the other thing. Right.
What are they doing instead?
First of all, they're utilizing the resources in the classroom, which I think is something that the pandemic has shifted, and teachers have had to rethink what this looks like, but the resources of the other students in the classroom and what the knowledge they bring. And they're letting learners experience math. Start with, I always say with my pre-service teachers, what does your student know? And how do you want to help them grow? And so it's putting them in a small group where they're using what they know and you give them just a challenge more to build on it, or you connect it to something that's happening in their community that becomes really vital. And so you're going to see a lot more discussion. We've got these teaching practices that we know from research are effective teaching, but we also have the practices we know students need to be doing if they're going to make these connections. They need to be able to say how they're thinking, and they need to be able to listen to how their peers thinking and say, that doesn't make sense. Would it work in this situation?
Sure.
And so a lot of it is that critical thinking that we need in our country right now to be able to critically analyze all the different data coming about us.
So I can walk into a first year algebra class of 30, 32 students.
Yep.
And they'll be sitting around desks, maybe 5 or 6 to a desk.
Mm-hmm.
The teacher starts the class by saying something. They're going to work on something here today. And it's so 2 or 3 minutes of explanation. The kids hunker down and start working on whatever it is. And they're arguing with one another. By the way, the kids are assigned to those groups with care.
Yes.
So the teacher knows that they're So they're all working on things, sometimes shouting to one another, getting excited about things. The teacher walks around, leans over a desk, helps some student, sees out of the back of her head somebody else struggling across the room, walks over there, helps them, and stops the whole thing midstream, has the kids share out where are they, how much have they found out what's going on, because they're usually open-ended questions that they're
Mm-hmm.
asking. And then finally, towards the end of the class, the teacher gets 1 or 2 students to sort of present, well, here's what I found out, and here's why this didn't work. Sometimes things that are wrong, they come up with a wrong answer to things, but they give it to the class, and then the class argues about it. And at the end of the class, the teacher may not even tell them exactly what the answer is supposed to be, because there isn't a supposed to be answer. They've been working on something. I often say, when you watch a great teacher do this, it's like the conductor of an orchestra who's standing up there trying to get everybody to look at all the different parts of the class and get them all to sort of work together. But it's an amazing thing to see when you see classes
When it's
run
working.
like that.
When it's working.
When
So
it works.
there
and
are
it's-
what, 1 million? So there's about 1.5 million middle and high school, secondary school teachers, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to guess that 20% of them, 10% of them, something like that, are math teachers. Something like this, about 150,000, something
And
like
it's
that.
about an eighth. There are about 500,000 math and science teachers in the US.
Okay. All right. So that even sounds high to me, but that's okay. So how many of them are as good as you're describing? How many of those classrooms operate now the way you just talked about, Megan?
Well, I would say I can't give you a number. I wish I could, but I also think it's hard to know what's actually happening in the classroom day in and day out. I wish it were higher. I know it's not where we want it to be, but I think part of it is that's where, like as math teacher educators, and we work on advocacy for math teachers to get time. The US is one of the few countries we allow so little time for teachers to get together and plan together and look at student data. What we consider instructional time is when the teacher's in the classroom with the learner. And so in order to grow, I just think my first year teaching, the students were so sweet, but oh my goodness, there's so much I would go back and do differently if I could.
Yeah.
So we've got to find ways to help support our teachers, keeping them in the field, but giving them time to grow and support, which is where something like John's group of developing master teachers and giving them that support and recognition becomes so important.
Okay. So how successful is it now? I mean, how good or bad was it 20 years ago? What are you looking for 20 years from now? Is it, I mean, because what you described sounds pretty good. I don't know how many of them are going to walk away a year from now going, yeah, I totally remember that. And I know how it applies, but.
What do you mean, remember that though? I don't, so we don't make teachers like this. We find them and then we bring them together in a community. The philosophy of Math for America is that you don't build great enterprises by looking at the weaknesses and building on them.
Right.
You build great enterprises, a big great university, a great
Mhm.
business, anything, by finding the best in it,
Okay.
by finding the best parts and building on that. So we take teachers
And when you
who are
say we,
already
you
great.
mean your organization, we?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
Math for America.
Thank
But
you.
and by the way, I mean, there are other organizations like us. We're not alone.
Mhm.
I can't answer your question about how many teachers there are like this, but it's a lot more than you think.
Cool.
And so, and the thing is, there could be a lot more still
Right.
if, as Megan says, we can support them, encourage them, model what that kind of behavior is. And so we need to kind of build on what's already working in the
Right.
classroom. And there's plenty of it that's working.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And almost every teacher is in it because they want to make a difference for learners.
Sure,
They-
sure.
and just as we're trying to tell our teachers, look at what is good in that child that we can grow and focus on their thinking. The same thing we need to do with teachers. We need to look at what are they experiencing, what are the successes they're having, and how can we build on that?
So I've had a pretty varied career over a lot of years. Okay. And one of the things I did was run a public television operation that had its own news department. And the news department would run after the legislators and they would talk about what happened in the day. And and they tried not to do plane crashes or, fires or any of that stuff. They tried to stay a little higher level than that. And one day the subject happened to be about teachers. There was a cut in teacher salaries or something like that. So my question to the group, and there was about 30, 40 of them, is, so are New Jersey teachers paid as much, more, or less than people in adjacent states? Seemed like a reasonable question. And then from there, is there a trend? Is this a one-time problem? Is this a problem that goes over time? Is this something that we typically have, waves where it gradually increases? Like, what does it look like? And there was a problem, not a problem I anticipated. Now, remember, news is a major source of information, right? And these guys are solid Emmy-winning professionals, and they've been doing it for a long time. And they looked at me and they said, "We don't know how to do what you're describing." I'm like, well, this isn't that hard. And B, we have very good relationships with teachers across the state. They can help you. They're like, we can't even conceive of how we would put that information together, no less how we'd put the story together. So I'm like, all right, maybe this was a one-off. Now, in many instances, whether it's been being in a senior role in a public company or whatever, and working with the finance people, it's like, you guys aren't exactly getting this, are you? See, like, profitability means the money we end up with at the end of the day after we've spent all the money. There is no new .com. That was the era, economics, right? It's just sort of like we're losing money. And it's like, yeah, but we make it up in volume. And of course, you want to treat yourself. So my in-person, day-to-day experience in business, in journalism, in classroom, in just hanging out with classrooms is, whatever it is that we're doing well within math education, either it ain't sticking or they're not getting it in the first place. Now, I've watched enough kids in the back of the room drooling out of boredom because they just have no connection to the material. And I'm sure you guys have seen that as well. So we're taking a very optimistic view here. But when I look at the adults and the result, and I've gone through this exercise recently and read through. So would you know how to translate a fraction into a decimal? They look at me like, well, I learned that in fifth grade, but I have no idea. I've never used it since, right? So all of that stuff suggests to me that either we don't need it or we're not doing it right, or there's a relevance issue or something. But it's difficult for me to kind of go, absolutely, I'm as optimistic as you are. Because and I'm a math guy. I like this stuff, right? I mean, where is it? Here. I mean, I'm working my way through this, okay? It's hard, but I'm doing it because I'm interested. So, and when I tell friends that I'm doing it, they're like, why would you do that? Like, just zero, nothing. So what's going on? And am I just weird? Like, I've run into these strange people?
Well, let's see. Let's start with your example of your news people who
Yeah.
were actually exactly right. What you asked them to do is not possible to do.
Oh, good. Tell me how.
Yeah. So it's there when you sort of compare things, you could take a set of things and they might be what's called linearly ordered. So you can always compare one with the other. One is either bigger or less than the other one.
Sure.
But there are lots of sets where that's not true. You take things and you compare them, but there's some things that can't be compared. It's not bigger and it's not less than, it's just not.
Pennsylvania average teacher salary, New Jersey average teacher salary.
So you
No?
wanted to look at the average teacher salary, but
Okay.
the teacher salaries are always set by a scale and they depend on the district.
Yep.
And the districts have different scales, wildly different scales in
Yes.
some cases. I'm in an area of the country where they are enormously different between rural places in New York State
Sure.
and New York City.
And even in neighborhoods. Yeah.
And so when you compare New Jersey to Pennsylvania or compare it to New York, do you mean compare average salaries? And
We
do you
can
mean
go
to
county by county. That's not a television thing, but it's a website thing.
No, but do you also mean, are they all teachers with the same amount of experience? Are they all teachers that have the same graduate degree or not, the same national board certification? What's the cost of living in the area? There's so many different factors.
But
So-
can't you parse any news story that way? I mean, I can do a full documentary on any and a 500-page report on it, but for news, we're gonna want to have an overall trend, right? We're gonna
It's
get
fine.
gotta
If you
get
want
an
to,
overall
if
trend.
you want to calculate an average salary for teachers and
Yes.
compare the average salary in New York to the average salary in New Jersey to the average salary in Pennsylvania, that's fine. But does it really tell you anything meaningful?
Okay, fair enough.
And so it's a complicated question. We're now just moving into data science and statistics,
Good.
which is a big area, which is complicated. And I'm proud of the fact that you had news people that knew that this just doing something like that was not going to be a meaningful comparison. They're good news people.
Good.
So so it's complicated. Here's the problem, I mean, education is really complicated. I am not a professional educator. I'm a mathematician. I've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot from the teachers I've come into contact, but I know that education is complicated. It's very difficult because everybody in the country thinks they're an expert in education because they went to school, or their kids or grandkids went to school. So everybody's is an expert in education. But I'm telling you, as a research mathematician, education is very, very difficult. It's complicated. And you can't just come at it because you or your kids have been in school and so you think you have all the answers. You don't even know the questions. So it's really hard. I'm speaking for Megan here, who
Megan?
is a professional.
Right,
Thank
yeah,
you.
exactly.
Well, it's so true. And you've also got all these other factors. It's not like students' learning of math is only what happens in that classroom. It's what they hear at home when a parent says, I've got to do that math. I just hate it. It's what they hear on the TV where there's the news story or the comedy that's making fun of math. There's so many negative images and things that teachers, yes, you're right. Teachers, we all need, I wish we could all be as engaged as our idyllic stories we're sharing. I think there are a lot of really amazing teachers doing that out there. But I think they're also having to fight so hard to be that brilliant because they're having to fight against what culture says about mathematics. They're having to fight against what every lawmaker not every, but what many lawmakers and parents and such may know from their own experiences rather than recognizing the professionalism that's there. So I do think that's definitely, it's not as rosy, but I think there's so many external factors that are impacting why students grow up the way you're talking about. And I'm hopeful. I see more change in the last 15 years than I did when I first started teaching, of students that are starting to come up and see, oh, wow, maybe I do need to hear it from another perspective. And I have to say a lot of that change in thinking in math perhaps comes from them growing up thinking that in other ways as well, thinking about multiple sides and perspectives about life in general, which is so critical.
So let me come back to the question that I had at the beginning. If I had you guys and people from other subjects, right? And we said, we can, the pool of time that we have to allocate to different subjects is limited. And there's a bunch of new stuff that seems to be coming in. Well-being education probably being the biggest of them, health education by extension, but also public health, which may or may not be related to health education. And then we've got the whole range of new technologies, whether it's nanotechnology, but also nanotechnology and the like. But also we have the bigger question about how do you survive in the 21st century? What do we need to know that we didn't need to know 20 years ago? And what tools do we have and that we need to be aware of as well? So we keep adding stuff. And we don't change the number of hours in school. So if you keep adding stuff, then you're going to have a smaller slice for everybody. So how do you jigger it? Because I know you guys initially were reluctant to, well, how many hours do we actually spend in math classes? But the reality is there is on every school schedule a box that says math, and it happens, let's call it 5 days a week, and it's 48 minutes long or whatever it is. And there's a certain budget allocation to that. And there are test scores that are associated with that. And there's tracks or levels because some students find it easier than others and all that. And some are more directed in one direction than another, and that's okay. So do we have enough hours? And I understand also that you do math in other subjects just as you do history in other subjects. But are we devoting too much time? Enough time? Should we cut down to 3 days a week? Do we need to be doing this in the way we do it for all 12 years? Just give me a sense of the expanding universe, the contracting universe, and how we actually handle the school boards that are really trying to figure this out and the students who are pretty overwhelmed.
Again, I think counting things in hours is the wrong way to look at it, but
we do.
But that's
the whole system's based on that, right?
No, it's not. It's not based on that. Nobody's figuring out exactly how many minutes you're spending on each subject. I don't think that's just the wrong way to think about it. All these other things, by the way, many other things are being integrated, not just in math, but in all the subjects. We're integrating we're upgrading the curriculum and integrating things. In math, for example, lots of math now has to do with computer science, for example. Computer science has come in and taken up a whole lot. Some of it has to do with data science, with statistics, with other kinds of things.
Which seems important, right?
It is important.
Yeah.
I think it's, I think we lost Megan.
Yeah, I did. Well, you and I'll keep going and she'll come back in.
Yeah. But it's unfortunately, I was about to sort of pass things off to her because
there she is.
She is.
She's back.
Because I think you have to separate this question between the lower grades and the upper grades. There's not a fine line. Things change it, over a few grades, 5, 6, 7. But I think that in elementary school, I think somehow you spend time on math, on various kinds of math, in a more defined way. In high school, you're spending time on subjects. You're looking at algebra and you're looking at geometry and you're looking at other things. And the right question there is, are those the right subjects, or should we be doing other subjects, or should we be integrating them in different ways? Mm-hmm. In elementary school, your question about time actually makes more sense in the sense that, so I should pass it off to Megan, who's the expert in elementary school.
Well, now, and I would also say, though, that I don't think it's necessarily time. It's how it's being spent in the same way.
But wait, let me push back on that. But it is time, because at a certain point, the teacher says it's 10:35 in the morning, open your math books, right? I mean, that happens everywhere.
Does it? No, it doesn't. I think that's
Am I stuck in 1980? That's okay.
Yeah, I think that's the pushback. In the schools that I see that are just absolutely flourishing, they're the schools where we're studying right now about space, and we're both our language arts and our engineering and our mathematics and science, all of these subjects, our history is all coming in as we're critically analyzing information. We're reading, hidden figures. We're doing all these things so that it's not necessarily math time. Instead, it's what are they learning? And that there are certain standards that we need to make sure, so that we don't want a student getting to high school and not conceptually understanding what we're doing when we're multiplying, or what fractions mean, or there's some foundational pieces, because it builds, as John mentioned earlier.
So how long does it take to embed those, to learn that basic vocabulary, processes, all of that? Is that a year? Is that 5 years? Is it 12 years? Like, how do you, and at what point do you go, you know what? Well, you really know, you're literate, you're numerate now. You know what you need to know to be able to get through the world. How long does that take? Is that, is that a lifetime?
I'd like to say yes, we're still all constantly learning. I think a big thing about K through 6 public education and K through 12 public education is that we don't want to shut the door on any possible future a child may have.
Of
So
course.
we're exposing them to a variety of materials and ways to think and ways to learn, so that they can be anything they want to be. And I think students' interests and experiences may have them focusing and strengths in different areas. So while one child may quickly make sense of a certain concept, another student may think about it more deeply. And so I don't think there's a set time. I think it's giving them experiences and asking questions and pushing them to be together. And I know that's not the specific.
Right, that sounds great for that very elevated school, but the majority of schools I've been to don't work that way.
So, but this would be my pushback. I'll go ahead and say that one of my schools I taught at had a 40% English language learner rate. I was the teacher that taught students that were identified as struggling learners, that deficit language that we so often use of where they're weak. And yet my students were brilliant, and they had so many strengths to bring to it. And when I taught using research-based strategies, my students flourished and lost the labels that school had given them. And so I think what we're talking about here, one of my doctoral classes, I loved Constance Camille used to say, I can tell you how kids learn, or I can tell you what happens in school. And what we've got to do is find out how to make school the place that kids can get their questions.
Again, aspirational, but as you're speaking, I'm looking at al.com, which I assume is alabama.com. And the little squib I'm reading is, we must unite, and you know this, and become reinvigorated, teaching reading and math to every student beginning as early as possible. Alabama's math scores were rock bottom in 2019, number 52 behind all states, Washington, D.C., and Department of Defense schools. So there is a rigor here, no? And it seems to me that it's not working in many places. We had a Tennessee episode last week. It certainly isn't working very well there. So if our goal, sure, the people up on top, great. But for most people, how much math education do you want to walk away with that's useful and productive? And as an investor, taxpayer, investor, how many of my little monopoly monies do I want to lay down on math compared to other subjects? And is that a student by student decision? I don't know what to do with it, because
this
I'm
watching my pushback to
not
say,
get it, right?
We're a state where, and many states are, where your teachers' hands are so often tied, depending on your district. It seems a lot of districts that get a label as a poor school may actually wind up then having their hands tied more. And there's so much standard scripted curriculum and things like that, that it's not always because a teacher can't teach that way, or that a learner can't learn that way if they were allowed. There's so much pushback from what's coming down legislation, what's coming down in the public, of how do we teach math effectively.
So if we gave the teachers full license and said, state, get out of this. We really just need the teacher and the student to figure this out together. How confident are you that the teacher base that we have right now could make a dramatic improvement, that the students could make it? Like, do we know what we need to know in the classroom, and it's just a matter of the administration around it is problematic? Is the curriculum not the right curriculum for those kids? Are they like, where's the problem?
No, of course not. Of course not. Every teacher is a fantastic teacher. We know that. But the questions you're asking about number of hours and are we spending enough time and everything isn't solving the problem. The problem is, or the goal is, we want more teachers who are like that. And we want every year to have more teachers like that. We want to set up a system that produces, attracts, and encourages more teachers to be like that. We want a system that gets better teachers.
Is that happening?
Yes, it is happening. And it could happen. If people would let it happen and stop. I mean, we're always in this country, we're possessed with the idea that we're in some kind of education crisis. And we all we do is focus on everything. In the most recent education bill, right? They had 50 amendments in that bill a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one of them had to do with the bottom 5%, the bottom 5% of the students, the bottom 5% of the bottom 5% of the schools. We only focus on the bottom in education. This is insane. If you were running a business, you would never come into a business as a new owner of the business and say, I want to find out the weakest part of this business and get rid of the weakest part of the business. And now I'm going to have an excellent business. That would be crazy. Certainly crazy if you were doing it at a university.
Right. I understand.
So we've got to take the good parts of what we have, which are substantial, and we've got to build on them.
But I can't figure out how. So you're building. I don't know whether you're building a house or a skyscraper. I don't have a sense of scale with this. I don't have a sense of how important is mathematics, because clearly you're both devoted to careers. So it's very important. For me, it's important, but it's not as important. If I go down the hall to somebody else, they're going to say it's important, but there's other things that are more important. So because we're in a public education system, we allocate resources. And I'm trying to get a sense of what is an appropriate allocation so that we do get a better outcome. We do get more students who both learn and remember, because I think there's a separation there. And if we're going to try to make everybody as good as the ones who are up top, that's great. What do we need to do that? And why are we doing it there as opposed to science or social studies or physical education or wellness? Because if we can't do everything at once, where does math fit in?
So the first thing is math is an enabling discipline.
Are there others?
Only one, but it's
no. Give me a sense of what are the others then? Because everything isn't, right?
Reading is, of course, reading is. You can't exist in society.
So reading and math. And what about writing? Would that fit in?
I would certainly put writing.
I would too. Yeah, you, Megan. Yeah. Would there be any others?
But I would focus on the reading and or whether it's I'm trying to think with reading and with math. At first, students have to learn. And not at first, but they learn to read and learn to understand numbers and number sense. Sure. But then they use the number sense and geometric skills and things like that they've developed and use the reading to learn other things.
Let me stop for a sec, because I think there are two other fundamentals. One of them is well-being, and I'm going to include in that getting enough sleep, being able to cope with stress, all of that. Because if you don't have that, it doesn't matter how good a reader you are, you're not going to get much done. And the other is taking care of your physical body, because if you're not getting out and exercising at least a few times a day, the likelihood that you're going to build what's necessary in your brain and be able to remember is very limited. So, and most schools aren't. So there's 5 right there, right? So that we're sort of saying that not in that group are social studies, science. Is that what we're saying? I'm not sure. I mean, at some point, everything can't be fundamental. It seems to me those are absolutes.
Fundamental is the wrong word. And so this is, I mean.
I'm being too objective.
Well, you're not being objective. I mean,
Okay.
you're being silly, frankly.
Okay, good.
You're, in a businessman's silly way.
Okay.
And I'll go back and say education is complicated, right? There are lots of parts to it. And so you can't do physics if you don't know mathematics.
Right.
You can't do chemistry. You can't do biology these days. You can't really function as a good citizen in this country if you don't have enough mathematics to sort of understand how to read graphs and how to fight back when people give you ridiculous statistics. And you need to have some sense of how to process the world around you.
And how do you think that's going based on the work we've all done so far? Would you say that most people are knowledgeable citizens who can parse that? I would say probably half are.
Yeah.
You got a big population that's not, right?
Well,
But we've been doing this for now 100 years or so, and we're getting better at it, no question. But you have to look at this and go, so are we doing the right things? And if so, are we doing them in the right ways?
We're doing this for 100 years. 50 years ago, about 50% of people graduated from high school. 100 years ago, 8%.
Yeah. We're making progress. Absolutely.
It's ridiculous to say we've been doing this for 100 years. What we're doing now is very different from what we did 20 years from now.
Okay, good.
So it's changed.
Yeah, I would also say with that part of it is that we've lived through an era of No Child Left Behind, where we're going to test and everybody has to know facts. And so even though educators and research may have said we need to teach critical thinking and problem solving, and so many of these skills that are part of mathematics that are essential, I think we're seeing, at least I feel, in a lot of adults now, the struggle of they learn to take tests rather than to think critically.
Yeah, sure.
And teachers may be rewarded if students can learn to take tests. Whereas hopefully now the pendulum may be swinging back to, we want learners who are productive citizens.
Right. And the way to get there is to provide them with a certain amount of math, science, English, whatever the subjects are, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, is that what we're saying? That this is an essential piece. Do they all need to learn the same thing? Or do we need at a certain, for a bunch of grades, we all need to learn the same thing? Because it would be good if we all added the same way, for example. But at a certain point, clearly from this conversation, our outlook, our interests, our subjective view of the world are different. And that's great. That's what it should be. That's what makes for a good, robust conversation. Shouldn't I be able to pick out what interests me?
You should.
At a certain point.
Absolutely. And I think, and here's the predicament in mathematics, right? I mean, so let's be really specific. You're a student and you've gone through the 8th grade and you've taken math, and now maybe you take algebra and you think, math really isn't just for me. I really didn't like it.
Or maybe algebra is not for me.
Yeah, maybe you don't even want to take algebra.
Yeah.
And so, okay, maybe let that student go. Let that student take lots of art and phys ed and other things in high school. But now they get to college and they want to take a science course, or they decide that they want to be a science major, or they want to be a doctor, or they want to do anything. And now it's cut off for them in the present system. It's cut off for them.
Does that happen a lot, or is that a relatively small cohort?
A huge amount, and
it does
happen even more. It's amazing. Look, I was at university for all those years. I can tell you there were lots of students who came in trapped because they hadn't kept up with math.
And
so it's a huge problem. And what's terrible about it, by the way, is that if you look at students of color, they're much more likely to make that decision.
Yeah.
So we're driving a system where we're only making it possible for people to be high-level scientific professionals if they've made the right choice at that point. Now, there's a movement in this country to try to find new ways to open up pathways for those kinds of students.
Yeah.
So that if they didn't want to take algebra 2, say in high school, or they didn't want to go on and take calculus, for God's sakes, which I hope they don't take, by the way.
Oh,
But I think so that they can still go into college, and there's another pathway into the profession at that point. But it's hard. It's not easy. I mean, this
yeah.
is a very difficult problem. And I think people are trying to find ways to do it. And I think it's clear, if you really don't want to take a whole lot of math in high school, that maybe that's a good thing. I don't want to force people to take mathematics, frankly, but be aware that you're cutting off options for them for the rest of their lives.
See, and I had the same problem with history. I wish that I had taken more history, and I feel that it cut off my opportunities.
Mhm.
But my son feels as though, my older son feels as though he wishes he had spent much more time with art history and with cultural history, because it really would have made a difference for him. And any number of other people make decisions that cut off other career options. Is math different from that?
Yes.
How?
Well, because it cuts off a lot of options. You cut off a lot of things when you don't have math. If you didn't take algebra, for example, in high school and stopped at the 8th grade in mathematics, you've cut off a huge part of the modern career options. You talk about a changing career paths in this
Right.
country. If you don't have mathematics, if you don't have any of that mathematics,
Yeah.
you're cutting things. You're really
Is there
cutting.
research that backs that up? Because I hear that argument, right? But is that a subjective thing you've observed?
No, that's not
Or
subjective.
is it something that we actually have research that we can share with?
Well, you can go to a college catalog and take a look and see what
No. I'm not asking
options,
that.
which majors would be cut off to you. I can tell you that
Right.
there's zero majors that would be cut off if you didn't take art history, and there are probably half the majors in the catalog that would be cut off if you didn't have the mathematics.
Okay, but
But
again, I'll turn
getting
our journalism argument around. But half the items in the catalog may not reflect half of the student body's work, right? Because some majors have more than, we can keep playing the
Absolutely.
game, right? So Megan, you look like you want to jump in here. So
Well, I was just going to share with art history. If I, as a teacher, decided I wanted to learn more about it, I could take these courses and learn about them. I'm going to go ahead and say that I had been teaching in the elementary school about 7 or 8 years when I wanted to know more about the mathematics. And I'll go ahead and say, I come from a math background. My grandfather taught mathematics, at a university. That is the background I came from. But as an elementary school teacher, I remember going to math departments at the time and saying, what is the way that I can not only learn about the research to help students, how can I grow in my math? And people
Sure.
like, you've left it behind so long, it's hard, and it's
Sure.
hard to pick back up. And so I think it's harder because it is such a building and scaffolding subject that you really do cut off those opportunities, and it's not as easy to go back and pick up math if you've been dropped from the experience early.
Spanish, probably the same thing. So I probably had
Yes.
7 years of Spanish, and then I went to Mexico a few years later and went, oh, gee, I didn't keep it up, right? So at a certain point, you do have to make decisions about what you are going to keep up and what you're not, because you have to build a career and because you have your own interests and all that. So it's hard to navigate this. And
Yes.
it's difficult for me because having done as many different things as I've done and used mathematics in a lot of different ways, working with set designers or any number of other things, I think that if I had stopped around algebra, I kind of enjoyed geometry. I actually liked the beauty of the proofs and all that other stuff. And I was a good student. I was good at it. But I think I got too much. I think that it robbed me of other time, which was the precious commodity in high school and in college and continues. And I wish I had spent that time doing something else. And I guess everybody has those kinds of regrets, but I didn't have much of a choice aside from, as I remember, calculus. I think I had to do trig, but didn't have to do calculus. Maybe trig was an option or not. So it's all subjective, but
Well, it's not all subjective. So by the way, you can never take a math course in high school and still be a very good human being, very smart human being, very successful human being. Absolutely. You do not have to take algebra to be an intelligent, smart,
Right.
successful person. But society needs enough people to
Sure.
take math so that society can function.
How many is enough? We have 350 million Americans. Do you want 3 million, 35 million, 300 million?
Yeah, but
Where's critical mass in there of people who are really knowledgeable and capable? How, I mean, do we need the majority of the population to
I
understand
want
this?
very few people to be capable in mathematics, because then that makes me much more valuable.
Yeah, of course. Right.
That's the fewer the better from my.
Yeah, fair enough.
But, and again, it's not that I don't want hordes of mathematicians running around the country. Not for that reason, but just because it's silly.
But I also don't think we're talking about mathematicians. We're talking
No,
about
no, I
general
want
public educated
scientists.
math.
I want people and statisticians. And by the way, journalists. I want journalists who are numerate. And
yeah, data journalism is an important part of this, right?
So I don't know the answer to the question how many, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
And they're in high demand right now.
Yep, absolutely. And it's a very good career path. And this is a very good basis for a career path. Megan, you were going to say something. Sorry.
No. I was just agreeing that I think, first of all, I don't think necessarily saying a course that it stops at, like algebra, is where we're at. We want all of our citizens to be able to critically analyze data and information. But when we look at our careers, when you think about scientists, engineers, when you think about doctors, when you think, all of these involve a great deal of knowledge about mathematics. It's not just mathematician.
Those people you just mentioned are about 3 million people. It's about 1% of the US population, that group of engineers and all that. And I know that because creative professionals actually is a larger number, to my surprise. It's actually about 4 million. So it's a bigger profession. So I just happened upon that knowledge along the way. And those people don't necessarily have a lot of math, having worked with many of them. A few of them do, but it's certainly not something that they focus their energies on. And sometimes that's a problem. Most of the time, at least in my experience, it hasn't been a problem. And the critical thinking is there, but it goes along a different neural pathway, right? They can look at it, analyze it, but they may not do that through the storytelling language of numbers and patterns and all of the stuff that makes math wonderful. They may do it through color and texture and feeling and emotion, but they get to a similar place. So it's not the only way, but it does have a very big seat at the table, right? Because you're not going to blow up a math teacher, but you will blow up an art teacher when the school budget, when that happens. Math is a very protected area of education. And I can understand the many reasons why it is. I would love everybody to be equally protected. They're not. The number of hours, coming back to that you devote to mathematics education is far greater than what you do for art education or for physical education. So we've made a decision as a society about what's important. And at this stage, having gone through the pandemic and watching a whole lot of really dumb decisions that seem to have killed a great many people, I'm looking at this going, well, we probably should be looking at everything and figuring out what we're learning and why, and seeing whether we're on the right track, because this is terrifying. We're going to hit 500,000 people in a week. That's insanity. And yet when I say, well, so 500,000 people, is that a lot? People are like, I don't know. I'm like, well, we're going to slow down. Yes, it's a lot. Is it similar? Do other places, how many people are in the United States? Haven't a clue. Really? Okay. Do we have more people than this country or that? I don't know. It's like, we're missing a step here. And I desperately want people to understand that 500,000 dead people is a lot of dead people. And I'm not sure we're getting that. So if we're not getting that, what are we doing for 12 years, right?
I think that goes to what John said at the beginning, was that importance of connecting math to culture and to our world around us. And that's something that was not done for when I was in school. And it's something that we really need to be doing more of.
Please, yes. Please, yes. So we covered a lot of territory. I have one last question for you. which is an obvious one that I know has come up. So there's a lot of smart technology coming down the road. A lot of math education is, we all do similar things, certainly through the first 6 years, right? So, and if I'm making a mistake, I'm probably not the only person who's going down that error path, which means that if it's a routine operation, and much of this is, that there could be real value in artificial intelligence and in machine learning if you have individual students learning from some sort of a master math program. When we get more sophisticated and we're into the design and patterns and all of that, that's not the question I'm asking. Is the question I'm asking valid? Is it reasonable?
Well, you haven't actually asked a question, but you've implicitly asked a question.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
And I think it's valid. I think we can certainly look at all the technology that's available right now. A lot of it's just software, not really technology. Yeah. And ask, is this a better way to do things? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And I would guess that it's going to change over time, and good teachers know how to make good use of all of the stuff that's coming out.
How about bad?
By the way, that's what's happened in the pandemic. It's been fantastic.
Sure. What about bad teachers?
Well,
do we want to replace him with, Eliza here or something? Like, do we want to find a piece of software and go, you know what, we're going to be better off if teacher, please step out of the way. Let the computer do some work here.
Well,
is that a reasonable thing or crazy?
Well, I think artificial intelligence has done a lot, and I think there's a lot of great technology out there to support learning. I still think our goal would be to support teachers in growing rather than replace, because there's nothing like the individual pedagogical knowledge of really knowing how to connect that content to that learner.
And the emotional connection too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
all of the sense and feeling and all that. All right, so we're going to roll credits. Please hang on for a minute just for a little post-chat between the three of us. So thanks, everybody, and we will be back in this cycle, either hitting math again or hitting another subject. But I learned a lot. Thanks to both John and Megan for allowing me to push hard. I don't always do that, but this was an episode where we did. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.